I pressed my lips to his and breathed. Not out of love, not out of longing, out of desperation. Because the most powerful and feared man in all of England was dying on the cold marble floor right in front of me. And I was the only one in that room who knew what to do. His chest was still. His lips were ice. The candles around us flickered like they were afraid of him, even in death. My name is Thomasina Breck, a physician's daughter with no title, no fortune, and absolutely no business being inside Hartwell Manor at this hour. But here I was, kneeling over the Duke of Calverton, pressing breath into his lungs with both hands, trembling and my heart slamming against my ribs. The butler was screaming behind me. 2 footmen stood frozen at the door. A countess fainted somewhere to my left. And I kept going, because my father always said, life does not wait for permission. 1 breath, 2, 3. Then his chest moved. His hand shot up and gripped my wrist so tightly I gasped. His eyes opened, grey and sharp and burning like a man who had just fought death itself and won. He looked at me, only me, like the entire room had disappeared. And in a voice rough as gravel and low as thunder, he said 3 words that changed everything. "You are mine." The room went completely silent. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up, curtsied, and disappeared back into the life I came from. But his grip didn't loosen, and something in his eyes made my breath catch in a completely different way this time. Now tell me, if a dying duke woke up and claimed you in front of an entire room, what would you do? I'd drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story already has your heart, please hit the subscribe button right now, because what happens next will completely shock you. I did not plan to save him. I planned to deliver a letter, collect my father's unpaid medical fee from the estate steward, and leave before anyone of importance noticed I had come. That was the entire plan. Simple, clean, safe. Hartwell Manor had a reputation that travelled far beyond its iron gates. People in the village spoke of the Duke of Calverton, the way they spoke of storms and famines, with a kind of fearful respect that left no room for warmth. He was brilliant, they said. Ruthless, they whispered. A man who had buried a wife, won 3 court battles against the crown itself, and dismissed an entire household staff in one afternoon without a single word of explanation. He did not smile at parties. He did not dance. He arrived, he observed, and people rearranged themselves around him, like furniture being pushed to the walls. His name was Dorian Ashvale, and I had never spoken to him in my life. But I had seen him once, 2 winters ago, standing at the edge of his estate during a snowstorm, completely still, watching the field like he was trying to memorize something he knew he was about to lose. There was something in that image that stayed with me, something lonely and fierce and too proud to ask for help. I thought about that image the moment I stepped through the servants' entrance of Hartwell Manor and heard the crash. It was not a small sound. It was the kind of sound that stops every heartbeat in a building. A heavy, terrible crash followed immediately by silence, and then screaming. I dropped my satchel and ran toward the noise before my mind had a chance to talk me out of it. The corridor twisted left, then right, past paintings of stern ancestors and walls lined with dark wood, until I burst through a set of double doors and into the grand receiving hall. He was on the floor, Dorian Ashvale, the Duke of Calverton. The most untouchable man in 3 counties was flat on his back against the cold marble, one arm stretched out, a shattered crystal glass beside his open hand. His face was ashen. His lips had gone pale. A tall, silver-haired butler named Mr. Greaves was on his knees beside him, or shaking the Duke's shoulder with trembling hands and calling his name over and over in a voice that had completely lost its composure. 2 footmen stood at the doorway behind me, frozen solid. A woman I recognized as Countess Drayfield was pressed against the far wall with both hands over her mouth. A young maid had already crumpled to the floor near the fireplace. Nobody was doing anything. I crossed the room in 7 steps. "Move," I said to Mr. Greaves, and something in my voice made him obey immediately, which surprised us both. I pressed 2 fingers against the Duke's throat. There was a pulse, but it was faint and uneven, skipping in a pattern that told me exactly what had happened. My father had described it to me 100 times over anatomy books and candlelight. The heart had stuttered. It had nearly stopped, and if it stopped completely before anyone acted, it would not start again on its own. I tilted his head back, the way my father had shown me on a practice dummy made of stuffed linen, and I did not let myself think about who this man was or what it meant to be, kneeling over him in the middle of his grand hall with half his household watching. I breathed into him. Once. His chest rose slightly and fell. Twice. Mr. Greaves made a strangled sound behind me. 3 times. I pressed both palms flat against the Duke's sternum and pushed, steady and rhythmic, counting under my breath the way my father had taught me, the way no woman in polite society was ever supposed to know how to count. The Countess fainted. I heard her hit the floor, but I did not turn around. 4 compressions. 5. 6. Then his chest moved on its own. It was a sharp and sudden movement, like a man breaking the surface of water after being held under too long. His whole body tensed. His hand came up so fast I did not see it coming, and his fingers locked around my wrist with a grip that had nothing faint or feeble about it. His eyes opened. They were grey. Not the soft grey of morning clouds or still water. They were the grey of iron that had been through fire, hard and bright and completely alert. And they found my face immediately, without searching, without confusion, as though even returning from the edge of death. Some part of him already knew exactly where I was. The room was so silent I could hear the candles burning. He looked at me for a long moment. His grip on my wrist did not loosen. And then, was in a voice that was rough from whatever had just happened to him, but still carried the full weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed, he said it. "You are mine." I felt the words land somewhere in my chest before my brain processed them. The footman at the door exchanged a glance. Mr. Greaves inhaled sharply. Someone in the corridor outside had stopped walking and gone very still. I should have said something sensible. I should have said, "Your Grace, you have just suffered a cardiac episode. Please lie still while we send for the physician." That is what I should have said. Instead, I said, "You were dead for almost a full minute. You should be thanking me, not making declarations." His eyes moved across my face, slowly, like he was reading something written there that no one else could see. Then the corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, surprised into existence against his will. "I remember your face," he said quietly, "from the snow." My heart did something I did not give it permission to do. He was moved to his chambers immediately after that, carried by 4 footmen under Mr. Greaves's frantic direction, while the estate physician, a round, breathless man called Dr. Pencut, came rushing through the front doors with his bag bouncing against his hip. I stepped back and let the professionals take over. I retrieved my satchel from the corridor where I had dropped it. I found the steward, collected my father's fee without making eye contact, and walked toward the servants' exit with every intention of never thinking about that room again. I made it to the gate before Mr. Greaves caught up with me. He was not a man who ran. What you could see that clearly. His dignity would not allow it. But he was walking very fast, his silver hair slightly disturbed, his composure held together by what appeared to be sheer professional habit. "Miss Breck," he said, slightly breathless. "His Grace is asking for you." I stopped walking. "That is impossible," I said. "He barely knows my name." "He knows it now," Mr. Greaves said. "He asked me to find the girl who brought him back. I told him your name. He said to bring you to him." The smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that every instinct shaped by years of understanding my place in this world told me to do, was to decline politely and go home. I went back inside. Dorian Oshvale was sitting up in a bed large enough to sleep a family of 6, wearing no coat and no cravat, just a white linen shirt open at the throat. It was looking furious about being made to rest. Dr. Pencott hovered nearby with a stethoscope and the expression of a man who had given up arguing several minutes ago. 2 maids stood near the window, doing their best to be invisible. The Duke's eyes went straight to me the moment I entered. That same direct, unnerving focus. "Everyone out," he said. Dr. Pencott opened his mouth. "Everyone," the Duke repeated, in a tone that did not repeat itself twice. The room emptied in under 30 seconds. Even the maids, who had been invisible a moment ago, disappeared completely. I stood near the door with my satchel still in my hand, telling myself that if he said anything inappropriate, I would leave immediately, and no force on earth would bring me back. "You saved my life," he said. It was not a question, and it was not particularly warm. It was a statement being examined for accuracy. "My father is a physician," I said. "I know the technique." "Dr. Pencott does not," the Duke said flatly. "He told me as much himself, which is the only reason he is still employed here." I did not know whether to feel sorry for Dr. Pencott, or simply accept that this was how the Duke of Calverton processed gratitude. "Your Grace should rest," I said. "Sit down, Miss Breck. I should be getting home. My father will be wondering." "I will send a message to your father," he said. "Sit down." There was a chair near the window, and I sat in it, because apparently that was the decision my legs made independently of my better judgment. He studied me from across the room for a moment that stretched itself out far beyond the normal rules of social interaction. He was not trying to make me uncomfortable. He simply seemed to be thinking. And thinking was something he apparently did, with his whole face pointed directly at whatever he was thinking about. "I am told you are Theodore Breck's daughter," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. Your father treated my groundskeeper last winter. He refused payment. Papa does that sometimes. I paid him anyway through the steward. He sent the money back." I smiled before I could stop it. "That sounds correct." Something shifted in the Duke's expression. Not quite softness. Something more like the recognition of a quality he had not expected and did not know what to do with yet. "What is your first name?" he asked. "Thomasina," I said. "Most people call me Thea." "Thomasina," he said, using the full name as though he had decided that was what it was for. And I felt it said that way, in a voice, like that land. Somewhere it had no business landing. "You should rest now," I said again, standing up. "Your heart needs to recover, and arguing with your physician and interrogating strangers is not how that happens." "You are not a stranger," he said simply. "Not anymore." I left before that sentence had time to settle properly, walking quickly down the corridor and through the entrance hall and out into the cold air of the late afternoon. I breathed it in deeply, trying to reset something inside my chest that had quietly rearranged itself without my permission. I told myself it was the shock of the afternoon, the rush of the moment, the strange, unreal quality of kneeling over a dying man and watching him come back to life. I told myself it had nothing to do with the way he said my name, and I almost believed it. 3 days passed, and I heard nothing from Hartwell Manor. This was reasonable. This was expected. The Duke of Calverton had suffered a serious cardiac episode, survived it, woken up, said something dramatic, and had presumably returned to being the powerful and untouchable person he was before all of it happened. People like him did not follow up. They did not send notes to physicians' daughters. They recovered behind their iron gates and got on with the business of running their estates and intimidating entire counties. I told myself this 14 times across 3 days, which should tell you something about how convincing the argument actually was. On the morning of the 4th day, a carriage arrived at our front door. It was not a common carriage. It was the kind that made the neighbours pull their curtains back and stare, dark and immaculate, with polished brass fittings, and a driver who wore his livery like a military uniform. My father stood at the front window, with his teacup frozen halfway to his mouth. A footman knocked. I opened the door. The letter was sealed with the Calverton crest, pressed deep into dark wax. My name was written on the front, in handwriting that was precise and slightly sharp at the edges, like everything else about its author. My father set his teacup down very carefully. I broke the seal. The letter was short. 4 sentences. It said that the Duke of Calverton wished to express his formal gratitude to Miss Thomasina Breck for her swift and exceptional action during the incident of the 14th. It said that he would be honoured if she would agree to take tea at Hartwell Manor at her earliest convenience. It said that her father was, of course, welcome to accompany her if propriety required it. And it said, in the final line, written slightly differently from the rest, in a way that suggested it had been added after some deliberation. I find that I have not stopped thinking about what you said to me. I would like to hear more of your thoughts. My father read it over my shoulder. He said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which was remarkable for a man who had an opinion about everything. Then he said, "We should both go." We arrived at Hartwell Manor the following morning. The manor looked different in daylight, less like a place where things happened, and more like a place that had been waiting a very long time for the right things to start. The grounds were immaculate. The gardens were winter bare, but structured and proud, full of shapes that suggested what they would be in spring. Mr. Greaves met us at the door with the kind of formal warmth that years of professional dignity allow, which is to say, he was perfectly correct, and only slightly human about it. He led us through the entrance hall, through a corridor lined with tall windows overlooking the east garden, and into a sitting room that was exactly what I imagined the inside of a very serious man's idea of comfort looked like. Dark wood, tall shelves, a fire already burning well, and 2 chairs arranged near a low table set for tea. The Duke was already standing when we entered. He looked entirely different from the man on the floor. He was tall, properly tall, the kind of height that a person notices not because it is unusual, but because he carried it like it was a responsibility. His coat was perfectly fitted. His cravat was exact. Everything about him was composed and deliberate, except for his eyes, which were already on me before I had fully entered the room and stayed there a moment longer than was strictly polite. He greeted my father with a respect that clearly surprised my father, who had come prepared to be slightly suspicious of a duke's intentions toward his daughter, and found himself instead being treated like someone whose opinion genuinely mattered. They shook hands. My father's posture changed. This was not what he had expected. "Dr. Breck," the Duke said, "your daughter saved my life using a method you taught her. That makes you, in some sense, responsible for my continued existence. I think that deserves more than tea. But we will begin there." My father laughed, actually laughed, which almost never happened before noon. "She was always my most attentive student," he said. "She had no interest in the needlework. I am deeply grateful for that," the Duke said. And then he looked at me, and the humour in his face settled into something quieter and more serious. "Miss Breck." "Your Grace," I said. "You look considerably less dead." My father made a small, controlled sound of alarm. The Duke's expression moved again, in that same way, the ghost of something that was not quite a smile arriving and departing too quickly to be certain it had been there at all. "I am told that is an improvement," he said. We sat. Tea was poured by a maid named Petra, who had the focused efficiency of someone who had been thoroughly briefed on the importance of this particular tea service and intended to perform it perfectly. There were small sandwiches, and 2 kinds of cake, and a bowl of fruit that nobody touched. My father and the Duke talked first, about medicine and the estate, and the condition of the roads between the village and the manor, which had been poor since autumn, and had made it difficult for local people to travel. The Duke listened the way powerful people rarely did, with actual attention, asking follow-up questions that showed he had heard the previous answer. I watched my father become incrementally charmed and tried to keep my face neutral about it. Then the conversation turned. "Miss Breck," the Duke said, setting down his cup with the particular deliberateness of a man changing direction on purpose. "I meant what I wrote in the letter. You said something to me in those first moments that I have been thinking about." "I said many things," I said carefully. "You had just nearly died. I was managing a situation. You said that I should be thanking me, not making declarations." He paused. "You are the first person who has spoken to me that way in a very long time." My father went very still beside me, doing an admirable impression of someone deeply absorbed in his teacup. "I did not mean to be rude," I said. "You were not rude," the Duke said. "You were honest. There is a difference, and it is one that most people in my position are never offered." He looked at me steadily. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer as honestly as you just did." "I will try," I said, which was the most truthful answer I could give. "When you came into that room and saw me on the floor," he said, "and everyone else was standing still and doing nothing, what did you feel?" The question was unexpected enough that I answered it before I had time to dress it up into something more acceptable. "Frustration," I said. "I felt frustrated that everyone was just standing there, when the solution was completely obvious." Something in his face opened slightly, like a window being pushed up from inside. "Not fear," he said. "Fear came after," I said. "It always does with me. The action comes first, and then the fear catches up later, and I have to deal with both at once, which is honestly quite inconvenient." This time the smile arrived fully and stayed. It changed his entire face. It made him look younger and much less like an oil portrait of a serious ancestor, and much more like an actual person who had lived in his own skin long enough to find things genuinely funny. My father made a small, involuntary sound of pure surprise and covered it with a cough. "Inconvenient," the Duke repeated. "Yes, I imagine it would be." The tea lasted another hour. When it was time to leave, the Duke walked us to the door himself, which Mr. Greaves clearly had not been expecting, because he appeared at the entrance hall, looking momentarily uncertain about where he was supposed to stand. At the door, my father went ahead to speak to the driver about something, or creating a gap of perhaps 30 seconds in which the Duke and I stood just inside the threshold with the cold air coming in from outside. "I would like to call on you," he said quietly. Not as a question, not as a command. As a man saying something true that he had decided deserved to be said out loud. "That would cause talk," I said. "It will cause talk regardless," he said. "I nearly died in front of 12 witnesses and woke up claiming a woman I had never formally met. The talk has already started." He was right about that. I had already heard it in the village that morning, from Mrs. Callum at the bakery, and from the postmaster's wife, and from 2 separate people who found reasons to walk past our house and glance at the windows. The story had spread the way all good stories spread, fast and warm and slightly more dramatic than the truth. "What would you call on me for?" I asked. "Conversation," he said. "More of your thoughts, which I find considerably more interesting than most of what is said to me in the average week." I looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was behind him, and it caught the edges of him sharply, his jaw, his shoulders, the line of his throat above the cravat. He was watching me with that same direct, patient attention. Not pushing, just waiting, like a man who was accustomed to deciding what he wanted and then simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. "Tuesday," I said. "My father is at the hospital on Tuesday mornings. I am usually in the garden." "Tuesday," he agreed. I went down the steps and joined my father in the carriage, and did not look back, because I had a feeling that if I looked back, he would still be standing there watching, and I was not ready for what that would do to the thing in my chest that had already been misbehaving for 4 days. "Well," my father said, as the carriage rolled away down the gravel drive. "Don't," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were thinking it extremely loudly," I said. He smiled at the window. "He looked at you the way a man looks at something he has decided belongs to him," he said quietly. "I have only seen that look once before in my life." "When?" I said, before I could stop myself. He turned and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts tenderness and mischief. "The day I first saw your mother across a room," he said. I knew then, too. It was quite inconvenient. He used my own words back at me deliberately, and I turned to look out my own window so he could not see my face, because I had a feeling my face was doing something I was not prepared to explain. Outside, Hartwell Manor disappeared behind a line of trees. And somewhere back there, behind those trees and those iron gates and those tall, dark walls, a duke who had come back from the edge of death was thinking thoughts that had apparently refused to stop since the moment he opened his eyes and found me kneeling over him. I understood the feeling entirely. What I didn't yet understand was what any of it was going to cost. Because things this large and this sudden, and this entirely outside the boundaries of what was possible for a woman in my position, always came with a price. Always. And the price was never simple. But Tuesday was 4 days away, and for now the carriage was warm, and my father was smiling at the window, and somewhere in my chest, something that had been very quiet for a very long time was making itself known in a way I could no longer ignore. I pressed my hand flat against my ribs, just for a moment, as if I could hold it still from the outside. It did not work. It never does. Tuesday came with frost on the garden gate, and a sky the colour of pale ash. I was already outside when I heard the horse. Not a carriage this time. Just one horse, moving at a steady, unhurried pace up the lane that ran along the side of our property, and I knew before I looked up that it was him. Something in the rhythm of it felt deliberate, intentional. Like everything else about Dorian Ashvale, he dismounted at the gate without waiting for anyone to help him, looped the reins over the post with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and walked toward me across the frost-stiffened grass in a dark riding coat, with his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He looked at the half-pruned rose-bush I was crouched beside, and then at the gardening gloves on my hands, and then at my face. "You actually garden," he said. "I told you I would be in the garden," I said. I thought that was a manner of speaking. "I do not speak in manners," I said. "I find it wastes time." He stood there for a moment, with the cold air between us, and something moved behind his eyes that I was beginning to recognize as the thing that happened just before he decided to be honest about something. "No," he said quietly. "You do not." He crouched down beside me without being invited, which startled me enough that I nearly dropped my shears. He was a duke. Dukes did not crouch in frost-stiff gardens beside physicians' daughters and examine rose-bushes, and yet here he was, studying the cane I had just cut with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to understand what he was looking at. "My mother had roses," he said. She was the only one who came out to tend them herself. The gardeners were instructed to leave them alone. What happened to them? I asked. She died, he said simply, and the gardeners finally had their way with everything. There was no self-pity in it, just the flat, clean shape of a fact that had been lived with long enough to stop bleeding. But it told me something about him that no amount of village gossip had managed to, that underneath all that iron composure was a man who still noticed the absence of things that had once been tended with love. I went back to pruning. He stayed crouched beside me, and we were quiet for a little while, which should have been strange, and was instead somehow the most natural thing that had happened in that garden in years. I looked into your father's work, he said after a moment. He is very good, I said. He is exceptional, the Duke said. He has treated 47 patients in the lower village over the past 2 years, and accepted full payment from fewer than half of them. The rest he has treated for whatever they could offer, which in several cases appears to have been vegetables and a handshake. I smiled at the rose cane. Nay, he considers the handshake the more valuable part. I want to fund a proper medical room in the village, the Duke said. Equipment, medicines, a full supply, in your father's name. I stopped pruning. I turned and looked at him. He was watching me with that steady, patient expression, not performing generosity, just stating it, the way he stated everything, like a fact that had been decided, and now simply needed to be said aloud. Why are you telling me and not him? I asked. Because I wanted to see your face when you heard it, he said. I did not know what to say to that. I was not accustomed to being watched for my reactions by anyone, let alone by a man who said things like that in the same tone other people use to discuss the weather. That is a very unusual thing to admit, I said finally. But I'm finding that I prefer unusual, he said, and the way he looked at me when he said it made the cold air feel considerably warmer than it had any right to be. We moved inside eventually, because the frost was becoming less atmospheric and more genuinely unpleasant. My housekeeper, Mrs. Dunlap, a stout and magnificently opinionated woman of 60, appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who had looked out the window, seen a duke crouching in the garden, and made several rapid decisions about what kind of morning this was going to be. She had tea on the table in under 10 minutes, and provided a plate of ginger biscuits with the energy of someone making a statement. The Duke ate 2 biscuits without comment, and looked entirely comfortable in our small, warm kitchen, which was so far from his marble entrance halls and tall, dark corridors that it should have felt absurd. It did not. It felt like he had exhaled something he had been holding for a long time. Mrs. Dunlap bustled in and out with the barely contained excitement of a woman who would have 14 things to say about this afternoon the moment he left, and I pretended not to notice. You were married, I said. It came out more directly than I had planned. He did not flinch. Yes, he said. Her name was Arabella. We were married for 2 years. She died of a fever 3 years ago. I'm sorry, I said. We were not a love match, he said, and then stopped, and I could see him deciding how much to say. We were respectful of each other. We were appropriate. But I do not think either of us was particularly known to the other, not in any way that mattered. That sounds lonely, I said, before I could consider whether it was too much. It was, he said, without any defense or deflection, just the clean honesty of it, sitting between us on the kitchen table. The loneliness of being beside someone and still being completely alone is a specific kind of loneliness. Worse than the ordinary kind, I think, because you cannot even name it properly. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and in the warm, biscuit-scented air of my father's kitchen, something shifted between us that was not quite what it had been a minute before. Thomasina, he said. Thea, I said automatically. Thomasina, he repeated, in exactly the same way he had the first time, deliberate and complete, and I understood that he was not going to use the shortened version, not because he was being contrary, but because he had decided the full name was what he wanted to call me, and that was simply what it was going to be. I gave up arguing about it. Internally, my face remained composed. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "You have been remarkably honest so far," I said. "It is slightly alarming." "I know what people say about me," he said. "In the village, in society. I know the shape of my reputation." "You are said to be brilliant and ruthless and cold," I said. "Also that you once dismissed your entire household in one afternoon." 14 of them had been stealing from the estate accounts for 2 years, he said. I gave them each a month's wages and a letter of reference, and told them to find somewhere else to steal from. I do not think that is precisely cold. "No," I admitted. "That is actually quite measured. The world prefers a simpler story," he said. "Ruthless is simpler. It requires less explanation." He looked at his tea. "I have stopped trying to offer explanations to people who have already decided what they believe." "But you are offering one to me," I said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked up. "Because you have not decided yet," he said. "And I find I very much want you to decide correctly." The kitchen was warm, and Mrs. Dunlop had stopped pretending to be busy in the next room, which meant she was standing very still just beyond the doorway, listening to every word, and I could not even be annoyed about it, because I would have done exactly the same thing. "Your Grace," I said carefully. "Dorian," he said. I paused. The name sat in the air between us like something delicate that had just been placed on a high shelf. "That would not be appropriate," I said. "Probably not," he agreed. "But I am asking anyway." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had nearly died on a marble floor and woken up claiming me in front of 12 witnesses. This man who crouched in frost-stiff gardens and ate ginger biscuits and talked about loneliness with the same directness other people use to discuss appointments and weather. This man who looked at me like I was something he had been looking for, without knowing what he was looking for. "Dorian," I said quietly, "just once, just to see what it felt like." He went very still. It felt like something was being decided. That evening, and after he had ridden back down the lane with one look over his shoulder that I absolutely did not see because I was not watching from the window, Mrs. Dunlop came and stood beside me in the sitting room with her arms folded and the expression of someone about to say something important. "That man," she said, "is not what I expected." "No," I agreed. "He looked at you like the room stopped existing," she said. "Mrs. Dunlop, I am 60 years old, and I have earned the right to say what I see," she said firmly. "And what I see is a man who came back from death and immediately started trying to deserve you." She paused. "That is either very romantic or very alarming, and I have not yet decided which." "Let me know when you do," I said. She went back to the kitchen, and I stood at the window in the gathering dark, where with frost reforming on the garden gate and the lane empty now, and I thought about the way he had gone still when I said his name. I thought about it for a very long time. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, and it caused the kind of disruption in our household that only a very official piece of paper in very expensive stationery can cause. It was from Lady Osworth, the Duke's maternal aunt, a woman whose social authority in the county was so well established that receiving an invitation from her was less an invitation and more a summons with pleasant handwriting. She was hosting a dinner at Osworth Park that Saturday, and wished to extend her warmest invitation to Dr. Theodore Breck and his daughter, Miss Thomasina Breck, whose recent act of courage and quick thinking had made such a favourable impression on her beloved nephew. My father read it twice. Then he read it again. "She called it an act of courage," he said. "She is being polite," I said. She is being deliberate, he said, looking at me over the top of the paper. Dorian Ashvale's aunt does not do anything by accident. He was right about that. The village knew Lady Osworth well enough to understand that every gesture she made was calculated with the precision of a chess player who had never lost a match. Extending an invitation to us was not kindness. It was positioning. She was placing us on the board. The question was why. I found out on Saturday. Osworth Park was everything Hartwell Manor was not. Where the manor was dark and weighted with history, Osworth Park was bright and social, and full of carefully arranged people who were all very aware of being carefully arranged. But Lady Osworth herself was a small, sharp woman of perhaps 70, with white hair pinned up with the authority of someone who had decided decades ago that she would be formidable, and had simply never revised the decision. She had bright eyes, the same shade of iron grey as her nephew's, and the smile of someone who always knew more than she was currently sharing. She greeted my father with genuine warmth, and me with the particular attention of a woman conducting an assessment she intended to complete thoroughly. "Miss Breck," she said, holding both my hands and looking at my face with no apology for the directness of it. "You are not what I pictured." "What did you picture?" I asked. "Someone more frightened," she said. "You are not frightened at all." "Not on the outside," I said. She laughed. It was a real laugh. I short and surprised, and clearly not something she deployed often. "Oh," she said, with great satisfaction. "You will do very well." I did not have time to ask what I would do very well at, because she released my hands and moved on to the next arriving guest with the efficiency of a woman who had somewhere to be in her own conversation, and I was left standing in the entrance hall of Osworth Park, wondering what exactly I had just been approved for. There were 12 people. Besides my father and myself, there was a Lord Pemfield and his wife, a quiet woman named Lady Pemfield, who turned out to have extraordinary opinions about botany that she shared almost exclusively with me across the corner of the table. There was a young barrister named Mr. Colton Hare, who was handsome in an uncomplicated way, and spent a great deal of the evening directing conversation toward himself. There was a retired admiral named Sir Rupert Drey, with a magnificent beard, and the laugh of a man who had spent years on open water. There was Lady Osworth's companion, a composed woman named Miss Felicity Oakes, who said very little and noticed everything. There was a couple visiting from the north, a Mr. and Mrs. Aldwell, who were interested in everything and offended by nothing, which made them the most pleasant people in the room. And there was the Duke of Calverton, seated directly across the table from me, who looked at me the moment I entered the dining room, and did not look away for long enough that Lord Pemfield noticed and raised an eyebrow at his wife. Or the dinner was elegant, and the conversation was layered in the way that social performances always are, the surface version that everyone could hear, and the real version happening underneath in glances and silences, and the careful placement of words. Mr. Colton Hare made his interest in me clear within the first 20 minutes, which was either confidence or poor judgment, and I suspected both. He asked about my father's work, then pivoted smoothly to asking about me, where I had been educated, what I read, whether I enjoyed society events, each question building towards something he was clearly constructing. Across the table, Dorian Ashvale was very still. Not the stillness of disinterest, the stillness of a man applying considerable effort to appearing unconcerned when he was anything but. "Miss Breck," Mr. Hare said, with the particular warmth of a man who had decided he was winning something, "I wonder if you might permit me to call on you sometime. Your father's work in the village is genuinely admirable, and I have some professional interests that might align." "That is very kind," I said pleasantly, which was not a yes. "Mr. Hare," said the Duke from across the table, in a perfectly conversational tone that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "are you still handling the Pemfield land dispute, or has that been resolved?" Mr. Hare blinked shifted and turned to answer, and the conversational current changed direction entirely, smoothly and efficiently, the way water redirects around a stone that has no intention of moving. Lady Osworth, at the head of the table, or looked at her nephew with the expression of someone watching a movie they had anticipated and were pleased to see executed correctly. After dinner, while the gentlemen had port in the study and the ladies arranged themselves in the drawing-room, Lady Osworth settled herself beside me on a small settee near the fireplace with the deliberateness of a woman who had engineered this moment from the beginning of the evening. "My nephew," she said, without preamble, "has not looked at another person the way he looks at you since he was 19 years old, and reading poetry he would have denied owning." "Lady Osworth," I said carefully. "I am not embarrassing you," she said. "I am informing you. There is a difference." She folded her hands in her lap. "Dorian has been managing his own life since he was 16, when my brother, his father, died and left him an estate in debt and a household in chaos. He has rebuilt everything: the estate, the finances, the reputation. He has done it with extraordinary competence and absolutely no softness, because softness was a thing he decided he could not afford." I listened. "He has not changed that calculation for anyone," she said. "Not for Arabella, God rest her. Not for anyone in the 12 years since. Until 4 days ago, when he nearly died on a marble floor and woke up looking at a physician's daughter like she was the reason the world was still worth being in." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, the gentlemen were laughing at something. "I do not say this to pressure you," Lady Osworth continued. "I say it because you should know exactly what you are holding. It is not a casual thing. It is not a fashionable flirtation, or a duke amusing himself with someone outside his circle. It is something that does not happen often, and does not come with the option of being put down gently and forgotten." She looked at me directly. "So, I want to know if you understand that." "I think I am beginning to," I said honestly. She nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who had asked the question expecting a performance, and received an answer instead. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." When the gentleman returned, Dorian came directly to where I was sitting, pulled a chair close, and sat down with the kind of focused intention that made Mr. Hare, across the room, find something very interesting to look at on the far wall. "My aunt spoke to you," he said quietly. "She did," I said. "Was she alarming?" "Considerably," I said. "I liked her very much." He looked at me for a moment. "She likes you," he said. "She told me so before dinner. She said you have the eyes of someone who counts things." "Counts things?" "Her phrase," he said. "She means that you observe more than you reveal. She considers it an excellent quality. She herself has been counting things for 70 years, and has never been significantly surprised." "What do you consider it?" I asked. He thought about it genuinely, which I had come to understand was something he always did, took the question seriously, and gave it actual consideration rather than reaching for the nearest, acceptable answer. "I consider it the quality I find most interesting in another person," he said. "The ability to see clearly and hold what you see quietly until it is the right moment to use it." He paused. "Most people say everything they know immediately. It is exhausting. Some people say nothing they know ever," I said. "That has its own problems." "Yes," he said. "I have been guilty of that." The evening moved toward its end. Carriages were called. Coats were collected. My father and Sir Rupert Grey had discovered a shared enthusiasm for Scottish medicinal plants, and were discussing it with the intensity of men who had found an unexpected kindred spirit and intended to make the most of the remaining minutes. At the door, Lady Osworth pressed my hand again, briefly, with a look that contained more meaning than a full conversation. Mr. Hare made one final attempt at offering his card to my father with a smile that was practiced and perfect and meant nothing. My father accepted it with equal polish and equal emptiness. Dorian walked us to the carriage. He shook my father's hand and then turned to me, and in the cold night air with the lanterns of Osworth Park burning behind him, he said nothing for a moment. Just looked. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Not a dinner. Not a social arrangement. Somewhere I actually go. There is a place on the estate, the old observatory my grandfather built. I have not shown it to anyone in years." "Why me?" I asked. It was the question underneath everything. "Because," he said, with the simplicity of a man who had thought carefully about the answer, and found it was actually very short, "that you are the only person I have met in a very long time who I want to be actually known by." The carriage ride home was quiet. My father, for once, said nothing. He simply sat across from me, in the warm, dark interior, with the expression of a man who had watched an entire evening unfold exactly as he had suspected it would, and was keeping his own counsel about how he felt about that. I watched the dark countryside pass outside the window, and thought about what it meant to be the only person someone wanted to be known by, what it meant to be offered that, and what it would cost to accept it, and whether the cost mattered at all when the alternative was returning to a life that had been perfectly fine and perfectly small and had never, not once, made my chest feel the way it had been feeling since a man came back from death and opened his eyes and found me. I pressed my fingers together in my lap and thought about an observatory that had not been shown to anyone in years, and a man who had rebuilt everything except the softest parts of himself, and what it meant that he was offering those parts now. To me. Of all the people in the world. To me. He came on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, and that small change told me more than any formal announcement ever could have. I heard the horse at the garden gate just after mid-morning, and this time I did not pretend I was not listening for it. I pulled off my gardening gloves, tucked them into my apron pocket, and walked toward the gate with the composure of a woman who had spent 4 days rehearsing exactly how she would behave when this moment came. I had not rehearsed well enough. He was not alone. Behind him, on a second horse, rode a man I didn't recognize, perhaps 40 years old, with sharp eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who spent a great deal of time observing things without commenting on them. Beside him, in a small open carriage that had pulled up quietly behind the horses, sat 2 women. One was young, perhaps 19, with bright, restless eyes, and the look of someone perpetually on the verge of saying something she had been advised against. The other was older, perhaps 55, angular and composed, with posture so correct it looked like it had been built rather than learned. As Dorian dismounted and looked at me with an expression that was simultaneously apologetic and completely unapologetic. "I should have sent word," he said. "Yes," I agreed pleasantly. "My cousin arrived from Edinburgh last night with his family," he said. "Mr. Prentice Ashvale, his wife, Mrs. Harriet Ashvale, and their daughter, Miss Luella Ashvale. They wish to call on the estate. I could not bring them to Hartwell Manor, and then come here and pretend this visit was not already planned." "So you brought them with you instead?" I said. "I brought them with me," he confirmed, with the tone of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to stand behind it indefinitely. I looked at the 4 of them. Mrs. Harriet Ashvale was already examining my front garden with the focused attention of a woman forming opinions she fully intended to share. Luella had climbed down from the carriage without waiting for assistance, and was looking at me with open, unashamed curiosity that I found immediately more comfortable than her mother's assessment. Prentice Ashvale had dismounted quietly and stood beside his horse with the patience of a man long accustomed to waiting for his family to decide what happened next. Mrs. Dunlop appeared at the front door, looked at the assembled party, and vanished back inside with the purposeful energy of someone who had decided this situation required an extraordinary amount of tea. "You had better come in," I said. What followed was the strangest and most illuminating hour I had spent in my own home. My father, who arrived back from his morning rounds midway through it, took one look at the room full of ash veils arranged across our sitting-room furniture, caught my eye across their heads, and sat down in his armchair with the serene acceptance of a man who had stopped being surprised by his life several years ago. Prentice Ashvale was quiet and genuinely thoughtful, the kind of man who asks one question and then actually listens to the full answer before forming a response. He asked my father about his medical work with a sincerity that made my father warm to him almost immediately, which was not a fast process under ordinary circumstances. Luella sat beside me on the small sofa near the window and asked me, within 4 minutes of sitting down, just whether it was true that I had breathed air directly into the Duke's lungs, and whether it had felt strange, and whether I had been frightened, and whether Dorian had truly said those words the moment he opened his eyes, or whether that part had been added later by someone who wanted a better story. All true, I told her. Strange, yes. Frightened afterward. And yes, he said exactly that, the moment he opened his eyes. She looked across the room at her cousin, with the expression of someone revising a long-held opinion. "He never says anything dramatic," she said, in a tone of genuine wonder. "At Christmas, he once responded to my mother's entire decorated table with the word adequate." "He has been considerably more expressive since the floor," I said. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that fills a room without apology, and I liked her at once, and completely. Mrs. Harriet Ashvale was the challenge. She had arranged herself in the best chair in the room with the authority of a woman who claimed the best chair in every room she entered, and had never once been asked to move. She was not unkind. She was something more difficult than unkind. She was measuring. Every time I spoke, she tilted her head very slightly, the way a person does when they are testing the weight of something before deciding whether to trust it. "Miss Breck," she said, during a pause in the general conversation, in a tone that pulled the room's attention toward her without effort, "your father is a physician." "He is," I said, "and you have no brothers." "I do not." "So you are educated in his work, to some degree, out of necessity." "Out of interest," I said, till the necessity followed. She looked at me. I looked back at her. Dorian from across the room went very still in the particular way I had come to recognize as him paying close attention without wanting anyone to notice he was paying close attention. "Out of interest," Mrs. Harriet Ashvale repeated slowly, as though tasting the phrase. "Yes. I think I understand." I was not entirely sure what she understood, but something in her posture shifted, barely, just enough, and the measuring quality in her eyes became something slightly closer to consideration. After they left, my father and I stood at the window and watched the horses and carriage move back down the lane. Dorian had lingered at the gate a moment longer than the others, and before he mounted, he looked back at me the way he had begun to do each time, was as though fixing something in place before turning away from it. "Harriet Ashvale does not approve," I said. "Not yet," my father said quietly. "But she is thinking about it. That is further than most people get with her in a single afternoon." I turned from the window. "Papa." "I am simply observing," he said, with enormous innocence. "You are narrating," I said. He smiled at his pipe. "Someone has to." That evening, a note arrived, not from Dorian, but from Luella, written in handwriting that moved fast and slightly sideways across the page, as though her thoughts were always slightly ahead of her pen. It said that she had been talking about me for 3 hours since leaving, and that she thought I was exactly right for her cousin, and that she intended to say so to her mother repeatedly until it took hold, and that she hoped I didn't mind her saying so directly, because she found that directness saved enormous amounts of time, and she had learned that from watching Dorian be indirect for years, and it had always ended in everyone being unhappy. I read it twice, and then set it on the desk and sat for a moment in the quiet of the evening. The thing in my chest that had been making itself known for days was not quiet anymore. It had stopped being a feeling I was managing and had become something I was simply living inside, the way you live inside weather, unable to step out of it, not entirely sure you would choose to, even if you could. 3 days later, Dorian came alone. No cousin, no carriage, no family arrangement requiring explanation. Just him and one horse, and the cold afternoon air and my garden gate. And when I opened it, he looked at me and said simply, "I want to show you the observatory. Today, if you will come." I went inside to tell Mrs. Dunlap where I was going. She handed me my warmest coat without a word, with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this particular errand since the first Tuesday he had crouched beside my rose bushes. We rode to Hartwell Manor and passed through it quickly, through the entrance hall and the long corridor, and out through a side door that opened onto the east grounds. The path led uphill through bare trees, their branches crossing overhead, like the arches of a very old and very honest church. The grass was frost pale, and our breath made small clouds between us as we walked. He did not fill the silence with words. Neither did I. It was one of the things I had come to value in the time we had spent together, that the silence between us was never empty. It was full of all the things being thought but not yet said, and it never felt like avoidance. It felt like trust. The observatory was a round stone building at the top of the hill, small enough to feel personal, and old enough to feel like something that had survived several lifetimes on purpose. The door was unlocked. Inside, a great brass telescope sat angled toward a circular opening in the domed ceiling, and all around the curved walls were shelves of notebooks, star charts, handwritten calculations, a lifetime of looking upward and trying to understand what was there. "Your grandfather," I said. "He spent 40 years in this room," Dorian said. "He mapped every visible star from this hill and wrote down everything he observed. Not for publication, not for recognition, just because he wanted to understand." I moved along the shelves slowly, touching the spines of the notebooks gently. "And you come here?" "When I cannot sleep," he said. "When the house feels too large. When I need to remember that there are things larger than whatever I am currently worried about." I turned and looked at him. He was standing near the telescope, with his hands behind his back, watching me with that same steady attention, the kind that did not look away when caught. "Why have you not shown anyone else this place?" I asked. "Because it requires a particular kind of person," he said. "Someone who will not make it into something it is not, or someone who will simply stand in it and understand what it is for." "And you thought I was that person," I said. "I knew you were," he said. "From the moment you said that the action comes first and the fear catches up later. That is exactly the kind of person who belongs in this room." I looked up through the open dome at the pale afternoon sky and thought about his grandfather standing here in the dark, writing down the names of stars, not for anyone else, just to know. And I thought about Dorian standing here, alone, in the sleepless hours, looking up at the same sky, carrying the same weight in a different century. "I am falling in love with you," I said. I did not plan to say it. It arrived the way the most honest things do, without warning, without ceremony, and because it had simply been true long enough that holding it in had stopped being possible. The room went very still. He crossed it in 3 steps, and when he stood in front of me, His expression was the most unguarded I had ever seen it, stripped of the composure and the distance, and every defense he had built over 12 careful years, and what was underneath it was something so clear and so certain that my breath left me entirely. "I have been in love with you," he said quietly. "Since you told me I should be thanking you instead of making declarations. I have been in love with you since before I had any right to be." He raised his hand and touched my face, just the edge of it, his thumb against my cheekbone, barely a touch at all, and it undid more of me than anything louder could have. "Thomasina," he said. "I know," I said. He kissed me. Not dramatically. Not the way stories describe kisses, with trumpets inside the blood and the world dissolving. Gently, carefully. The way a man kisses a woman when he is certain and does not need to prove it. And it was the most complete thing I had ever felt, standing in his grandfather's observatory with the pale sky overhead and the notebooks full of patient, faithful observation on every wall around us. Two people who had both spent their lives paying attention to things, finally paying attention to each other. We stood there for a long time after, not speaking, and the silence was the fullest it had ever been. The trouble arrived on a Friday, the way trouble always does, quietly and through the front door. I was in the village when I first heard it. Not from Mrs. Callum at the bakery this time, nor from the postmaster's wife, but from Dr. Pencott himself, who stopped me on the street outside the apothecary with the expression of a man who had been carrying an uncomfortable piece of information and was relieved to find someone he could hand it to. "Miss Breck," he said, lowering his voice in the way people do when they want to be certain they are heard, "I think you ought to know that there are people speaking about you and His Grace." "People have been speaking since the night it happened," I said. "Not like this," he said. He hesitated, pulling at the buttons of his coat. "There is a woman, Lady Dunmore. She arrived in the county 4 days ago from London. She was understood, at one point, to have a particular interest in the Duke's situation, a matrimonial interest of long standing." I looked at him steadily. "And? She has been saying things," he said, "in company, that what happened in the hall was a hysterical overreaction by an untrained girl, that the Duke's words upon waking were the confused utterances of a man who had just suffered a medical episode and should not be treated as meaningful, that a physician's daughter with no fortune and no family connections attaching herself to a Duke of Calverton's standing is precisely the kind of opportunistic behavior that society ought to recognize and resist." The words landed with the cold precision of things that had been designed to land exactly that way. "I see," I said. "She is saying it in the right rooms," Dr. Pencott said, with genuine discomfort. "She is well connected. Lady Dunmore has the ear of several people whose opinions carry weight. I thought you should be warned." I thanked him, and I walked home, and I sat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Dunlop put tea in front of me without being asked, and stood by the window with her arms folded and her jaw set, which was her posture for wars she had decided to fight. My father came home an hour later. I told him everything. He sat across from me and listened, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I am going to wait," I said, "and see what he does." What Dorian did was arrive the following morning before I had finished breakfast, which had never happened before, and his face when I opened the door told me he already knew. He knew, and he was angry, and not at me. "Come in," I said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he had occupied the first morning, and I poured tea I suspected neither of us would drink, and he told me what he knew. Lady Dunmore had arrived with letters of introduction from 3 London families, all of which were connected to the peerage, and she had spent 4 days engineering exactly the kind of social pressure that was most effective, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and persistent, moving through drawing rooms and dinner tables, and leaving behind the particular residue of a woman who knew how to shape opinion without appearing to. She told Lady Pemfield that you had fabricated the severity of my episode, he said, with a flatness in his voice that I recognized as the outer layer of something much hotter underneath. She told the Aldwells that I was not in my right mind when I spoke. She told 3 separate people that you had been asking questions about the Calverton estate before the incident, which is an absolute lie designed to make you appear calculating. I wrapped my hands around my teacup. How do you know all of this? Miss Felicity Oakes, he said. My aunt's companion. She hears everything and tells my aunt everything. And my aunt told me this morning, over a letter that contained, I will say, considerably stronger language than I expected from a woman of 70. I thought of Lady Osworth's bright, iron-grey eyes, and her careful, deliberate movements across a room, and I believed entirely that her letter had contained strong language. I believed she had enjoyed writing it. What does Lady Dunmore want? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. What she has always wanted, he said. An arrangement that serves her family. She had expectations, not from me directly, I want to be clear. I made no promise to her and no encouragement was given, but expectations nonetheless, based on nothing more than the assumption that a duke of my age and position would eventually need a suitable wife, and that she had positioned herself as the obvious candidate. He looked at me across the table, direct and steady. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly, because there is no version of your answer that will change what I intend to do. This is not a conditional question. Ask, I said. Has any part of this frightened you enough to make you want to step back from it? He said. Not the feeling. I know the feeling. I mean the practical reality of it. The talk, the pressure, like the position you are being placed in. Has it made you want to retreat to a simpler life? I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the observatory, and the notebooks, and the pale sky through the dome. I thought about his grandfather writing down star names alone in the dark, just to know. I thought about a man coming back from death and opening his eyes and finding my face. No, I said. It has made me angry, which is different. Something moved through his expression, swift and warm and completely certain. Good, he said. Then here is what is going to happen. What happened was not a confrontation, not a dramatic declaration in a ballroom, not any of the things that stories usually provide at this point. What happened was Dorian Ashvale, Duke of Calverton, doing what he apparently did in every situation that required resolution, proceeding with calm, deliberate, unstoppable intention. He called on Lord and Lady Pemfield himself and spent an hour in their sitting room. I do not know exactly what was said, but Lady Pemfield sent me a letter the following day that was warm and direct, and contained an invitation to her greenhouse to see her new botanical specimens, which I understood to be her version of choosing a side. He spoke to the Aldwells at a dinner at Mr. Greaves's coordination, where he seated Lady Dunmore far enough from the centre of the table that she spent the evening talking to people who were politely but thoroughly uninterested in her narrative about Thomasina Breck. Luella Ashvale, the operating entirely on her own initiative, and with the particular joyful ferocity of a 19-year-old who has found a cause she believes in completely, apparently spent 3 days telling everyone she encountered that her cousin had never in his life said anything he did not mean, and that she had personally witnessed Thomasina Breck be wonderful, and anyone saying otherwise was simply wrong. Mrs. Harriet Ashvale, to my genuine surprise, said nothing publicly against me. And then, more surprising still, she came to call on me alone, without Prentice, without Luella, just herself and a carriage and that immaculate posture, and sat in my sitting room and looked at me with the measuring expression I remembered from our first meeting. "I do not approve of this," she said. "On principle. His Grace should marry within his station. Well, you know that." "I know that is the expectation," I said. "I also know," she said, more slowly, "that my cousin has not looked at anything with that degree of certainty in 12 years. And I have watched him manage his estate and his grief and his reputation with extraordinary competence and no visible joy for longer than I would like to admit." She paused. "Luella is right about one thing, which I will never tell her because she is already insufferable about being right. He means exactly what he says. He always has." I waited. "I am not going to interfere," she said finally, with the decisive air of someone closing a door they had been holding open for the sake of thoroughness. "I simply wanted you to know that I see what you are, not what you have, what you are. And I think it may be exactly what that man has been missing." She left 20 minutes later with the same perfect posture, and I sat in the chair she had vacated and thought that this was the strangest and most layered family I had ever been drawn into the orbit of, and that I could not imagine wanting to be anywhere else. The formal proposal came on the last day of November. Not at a dinner, not in a drawing room, not at any arranged social occasion. He came to the observatory, where he had been 3 times more with me since the first visit, and where I had begun keeping one of my own notebooks on the 3rd shelf, a habit that had started spontaneously, and that he had noticed without commenting on, simply making space for it, the way he made space for everything about me, quietly and completely. We were standing at the dome, opening, looking at the late afternoon sky, which had gone the deep amber and rose of a day burning itself out well, when he turned to face me. He did not kneel. He was not that kind of man, and I was not that kind of woman, and we had moved past the performance of things weeks ago in favor of the actual substance of them. He simply turned and looked at me and said it. "Marry me, Thomasina." Not a question, the same way he had said everything from the beginning, as a statement of something he had examined and found to be true and was now saying aloud because it deserved to be said. I looked at him in the amber light, this man who had come back from the edge of death and opened his eyes and found me kneeling over him. This man who crouched in frost-stiff gardens and ate ginger biscuits in small kitchens and showed people star charts in old stone rooms when he could not sleep. This man who had rebuilt everything in his life with extraordinary care, and who was now standing in the last place that had never been rebuilt, the soft, original place, and offering it without conditions. "You are absolutely certain," I said. "Not a question either." "I have been certain," he said, "since the snow. I simply did not know what I was certain of yet." I stepped forward and closed the small distance between us, and I took both his hands in mine, which were still slightly cold from the outside air, and I looked up at him and said the only word that had been true since the first moment I pressed my lips to his, and breathed. Yes. He did not make a dramatic sound. He did not sweep me off my feet. He simply exhaled, slow and deep, the way a man breathes when something that has been wound very tightly inside him finally releases. And then he brought both my hands up and pressed them against his chest, against the heart I had once restarted with my own hands, and held them there. We were married in early spring, when his grandfather's rose garden at Hartwell Manor was just beginning to show colour again after the long winter. The first time it had been tended with any kind of love since the old Duke's mother had walked its paths decades before. I had started on it in February, quietly, with Mrs. Dunlap's enthusiastic assistance, and Dorian's complete inability to walk past a window overlooking the garden without stopping to watch. And my father gave a toast at the wedding breakfast that made Lady Osworth laugh, and made Luella Ashvale cry, and made Mrs. Harriet Ashvale press her lips together in the way that, I had learned, was her version of being moved. Dr. Pencut sat near Sir Rupert Dray, and they argued cheerfully about Scottish medicine. Mr. Greaves stood near the door of the dining-room with the expression of a man whose household had finally arranged itself correctly, and who intended to maintain it that way indefinitely. Dorian held my hand through all of it, underneath the table where no one could see, in the particular way he held things he had decided belonged to him. Not with possession, with certainty, which is an entirely different thing, and the most important one. That night in the observatory, with the spring stars fully out and the dome open to the sky, he added one line to the bottom of his grandfather's last notebook, the one that had been sitting unfinished for 30 years. Just a date and 2 names, and below them, in his sharp, precise handwriting, the words, "She brought me back." I leaned my head against his shoulder and looked up at the stars and thought about all the things that had to happen exactly as they did for us, to end up standing in this room together. The letter I had come to deliver, the crash I had run toward, the 12 witnesses and the cold marble floor, and the words he had said when he opened his eyes and found me. Some things are not accidents, even when they look like them. Some things are just the world finally doing what it had always been building toward, patient and certain, the way stars are, burning their light across impossible distances, trusting that someone somewhere is watching. I was watching. He came back. And now, here, in the warm stone quiet of a room built for looking at things that last forever, the heart I had once fought so hard to keep beating was full in a way I had no words for, so I did not try. I simply stayed. Now tell me, if a man looked at you the way Dorian looked at Thomasina and said those words from the very beginning, would you have stayed or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. If this story moved something in you, please hit the subscribe button right now. We have more stories like this one waiting for you, and you do not want to miss what comes next.